Hi, SouthRidge. My name's Mark, and I've been a partner here at SouthRidge along with my wife, Karen, for the last 25 years. I also work at Baptist Housing, which is a ministry of our denomination, Fellowship Pacific, where we serve seniors across BC, offering housing, healthcare, and spiritual care in 21 communities across the province. I grew up in Tsawwassen, which is where I followed Jesus as my Savior. And it's also the place where Food on the Corner got its start. In 1982, Herman Glockel was watching his television news in Tsawwassen, and there was a story about a homeless feeding ministry in Quesnel, BC on the TV news. Well, Herman could hear God's voice in his ears saying, "Feed my sheep, get involved, be my hands and feet." And so Herman responded to that by asking his wife, Erica, to make a pot of soup. And he asked his friend Wayne to help him find a location downtown where they could serve the homeless of Vancouver. All they had, Herman says, was their faith prompting them. Faith and a Ford Pinto station wagon. That's what they drove down there on that first Saturday, back when Food on the Corner started. When my wife Karen and I first came to know Jesus, it was a friend of mine who was very influential in my spiritual growth, who invited us to be involved and serve at Food on the Corner. I believe it's part of my journey, but part of every journey, that once we follow Jesus, he then sends us out into the world to be his hands and feet. Herman was sent to serve the homeless in Vancouver, and almost 10 years later, I was sent to join him at Food on the Corner. You might be watching the news today or scrolling through social media on your device, and you see what's happening in Ukraine with the war there and the devastating impacts of everything and the refugees that are spilling over into the neighboring countries. And many of us hear God's voice saying, "Get involved, do something, be my hands and feet." And at the same time, we feel a sense of inadequacy. How can we make a difference? What can we do? Well, it's the same with the devastating wildfires that swept through Lytton last summer. God stirs our hearts to respond, and we think, how can we make a difference? What can we do? But I'm one person. We're just one church. Can we make a difference? But we are getting involved, and we are helping to respond, and we are making a difference there. It's in circumstances like these that I believe God is calling his followers to become sent ones with hearts of compassion, acting in faith. I'm sharing today from the book of Mark, chapter 6. And by way of context, Jesus has been trying to move his disciples from being his followers to being his sent ones. That's what the word apostle means. When we talk about the 12 apostles, Simon, Peter, Andrew, James and John, Philip and the gang, these were the official apostles, the sent ones of God. And when Jesus ascended to heaven, he said, "You'll be my witnesses." And they were charged with spreading the gospel, the truth about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And that's what the book of Acts is about when these apostles go out into the world. But back here in the book of Mark chapter 6, the disciples are not yet sent ones. Jesus is trying, but they're having a hard time picking up what he's throwing down. They even have a hard time understanding who he is most of the time. Just like us, sometimes they get it and sometimes they don't. Jesus had just sent them on this missionary journey. Hands up, how many people have been on a short-term missions trip? Well, lots of us have, because SouthRidge has a long-standing commitment to send teams out on short-term trips. We've been to Mexico and Poland, to Greece, to Haiti, and we're even going to go to Lytton. It's an experience of being sent with a gospel purpose. And when Jesus sent them, he empowered them with his authority to teach, to heal, and to perform miracles. He sent them, according to Matthew's gospel, to the lost sheep of Israel. And this language of lost sheep is important to God's view of people. He cares deeply for people who he considers to be lost sheep or sheep without a shepherd. And if you think you might be a lost sheep today, I want you to know that Jesus cares deeply for you. After every short-term missions trip, there's always a team debrief when we gather together to share what we've learned and how God worked. And if you've been on a short-term missions trip, I'm sure you've debriefed with your team and shared those God-working stories. Jesus was having one of these debriefs with his disciples in Mark 6, verse 30, where it says, "The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught." They get interrupted though, and he tries to take them to a solitary place. But the people see where they're going, and the multitude that has been following Jesus around shows up. You might know this story because this is where the feeding of the 5,000 happens. And after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus tells his disciples to get into a boat and go across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he'll meet them there. And then he goes up the hill to pray. Well, many of us are familiar with this story too, because this is when Jesus comes to them walking on the water. Now, Jesus walking on the water probably shouldn't surprise anyone at this point, because up till now, the disciples have seen Jesus turn water into wine, cast out a legion of demons, heal the sick, and even raised a girl from the dead. If you and I had seen Jesus do all of this in person, we wouldn't be surprised to see him coming to us walking on the water, would we? Well, maybe we would, because it's a pretty cool feat. But the disciples were surprised. They didn't even recognize him. They actually thought he was a ghost. And in Mark 6, verse 50 to 52, we read, "Immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened." The disciples were completely amazed, Mark says. Not only did Jesus walk on water, but he calmed the wind to stillness. Amazing. Then Mark provides one little detail that I can't get out of my head. Only Mark in his gospel shares that they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. What? What does walking on the water have to do with the loaves? What loaves is he talking about? Well, for Mark, the story isn't necessarily about the storm or walking on water. It's about the loaves from the previous story. Mark wants us to go back to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. There's something important that we've missed there. It's so important that Mark is attributing the disciples' lack of faith and their amazement during the storm to their hard hearts. They hadn't understood about the loaves. So let's see if we can find out what the disciples missed. I'm going to read from Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. "The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest.' So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. 'This is a remote place,' they said, 'and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countrysides and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered, 'You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?' 'How many loaves do you have?' he asked. 'Go and see.' When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute among the people. He also divided up the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. In John's Gospel, we read that the feeding of the 5,000 was a test for the disciples, because John says that Jesus already had in mind what he was going to do. I think this is a clue for us. Fresh back from their missions trip, full of stories of their journey, the multitude comes and finds them and presents yet another opportunity for ministry. We can imagine Jesus thinking to himself, okay, let's see what they've learned. Now, one of those nuances that I don't want us to miss is the language of verse 30. They reported all they had done and what they had taught. It's just a nuance, but notice that they reported what they had done and not what God had done. Sometimes our involvement in ministry is less about serving and sometimes more about ourselves. It's really the difference between volunteering on our terms and serving on God's terms. Some volunteers choose what they will do and what they won't do. What seems fun? What's in it for me? What did I get out of it? And this is hard-heartedness. The servant says, "Here am I, send me. I'm here to serve. Tell me what you need." It's all about impact for the kingdom of God. Well, Jesus is testing the heart and the faith of his disciples in this moment on the heels of this missions trip debrief. In verse 34, we see Jesus, when he landed, saw a large crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. What does the large crowd look like to the disciples? And what does the multitude around us look like to you and me? Is the group around you a group that you want to serve? Are the people on your doorstep people that you look at with compassion? So often our hearts are hard to the world, and we lack the compassion that reflects God's heart. To Jesus, they looked like sheep without a shepherd. They looked like people who were lost and needed shepherding. And so Jesus had compassion for them deep in his heart, and he responded. Jesus' compassion for the people stood in contrast to the heart of the religious leadership of his day. They often looked down on the people that Jesus cared for because they were dirty or sinners or outcasts. Jesus had compassion for them in a different way. And this should be a warning for us, to give us some insight on how God views the multitudes around us as lost sheep without a shepherd. Let me read a few verses from Ezekiel 34, where God condemns shepherds who are self-centered and don't have the best interests of the sheep at heart. Ezekiel 34, "Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the Lord, because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock, I'm against the shepherds and will hold them accountable. I will remove them from tending the flock. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries. I will tend them in a good pasture. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. I will shepherd the flock with justice." This is God speaking in Ezekiel 34 of how he will step in to care for lost sheep from a place of compassion. And this is his compassion for people like you and me. We are sheep that God has gathered to shepherd. And I know I needed shepherding before I knew Jesus. Didn't you? This is God's heart of compassion. And Jesus was testing to see if the disciples would have this heart for the multitude. In the story of Food on the Corner, Herman saw homeless people on his television and he felt compassion for them. He heard God's voice saying, "Feed my sheep." Well, one of the reasons why Herman saw part of his own story on that TV. Part of Herman's reason, his motivation to serve the homeless of Vancouver, came from growing up in Germany after World War II. When we think about what's happening in Ukraine and the loss of home, access to food and supplies, and people having to flee for their own safety, this is the story of many people during and after the Second World War. Herman's family received care parcels and food hampers to help them survive. It was caring people in North America who sent supplies and food to help them. Herman says, I never forgot that and how good the food tasted. It was heavenly almost. Kind of like a hot bowl of soup after sleeping on the street in Vancouver. You see, Herman never forgot his history, and God used his own time of need to stir within him a compassion for others who were just like him. When Karen and I served at Food on the Corner in Vancouver, we met people that helped us to understand that homeless are just like us, and they're not far from us. I guarantee there are people listening today, whether online or in church, who have been homeless at one point or another. Circumstances shift and change, and any one of us could be in this situation in the future. Well, one Saturday morning, I looked up from the soup pot, and a guy from my own high school was standing in front of me. Randy was in the line, receiving a bowl of soup from me. I knew Randy didn't fit in so well when he moved to town. I think it was grade 11 or 12 when his family moved here from the US. They were transferred here for work, I think. And 3 years later, here he is, standing in the soup line. He had become homeless in that period. It was awkward, and he was a little bit embarrassed to see me, and as a result, I didn't get to hear his story. But every homeless person has a unique story, and every one of us is a couple of steps and circumstances from being on the other side of the table. That day opened my eyes to the underlying reality that the multitude of homeless I was serving were just like me. It was like I was in the soup line. Well, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, there's an underlying reality that the multitude was a group of sheep without a shepherd. And the disciples had forgotten in that very moment that they were sheep without a shepherd before Jesus found them. Everyone needs compassion. Every person excluded from community deserves an opportunity to be invited into community. Well, the disciples are not there yet. They want to send the multitudes away. In verse 35, we read, "By this time, it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. 'This is a remote place,' they said, 'and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.'" Send the people away, Jesus. Notice back in verse 30 that it was the apostles who gather around Jesus. The word apostles is used there because they were sent ones of God on that missionary journey, gathering to report back on their mission. But by verse 35, they're called disciples again, as they ask Jesus to send the people away. This is our story too. At times, we're sent ones, fully embracing the power of God and having faith to serve Him in spite of our own fear and feelings of inadequacy. Other times, we revert back to being disciples again, learning and relearning what it means to have faith and impact the world with God's heart and with His power. We vacillate. We wonder, reading the story, how the disciples are not yet in step with Jesus after everything they've seen. Michael Card writes that they have a stubborn disbelief even though they've received private instruction from Jesus, even though they've been out on their first successful mission. How could they have been so blind, he writes. How could we be so blind? Yes, we're the same. After everything we've seen Jesus do in our lives, in terms of our rescue and our healing, sometimes we still have hard hearts and lack compassion and faith to be sent ones in the world. When we have a lack of faith, we're just like the disciples, sending the masses away. We don't put our loaves and our fishes on the table. We stew in our sense of inadequacy or naysaying. We focus on what we can't do, and that spills over into what we believe God can do. And all the while, the God of compassion wants to work through us. What if Herman had said no to God? What if Herman had said, "Send them away, Jesus"? Unfortunately, there were those voices when Food on the Corner was starting. Some people actually said, "Why would you feed those lazy people? They should find a job and get to work." Herman's response was to ignore those voices and to continue to serve on the corner every Saturday. If Herman had said no to God, I would have never been sent to serve at Food on the Corner personally. If Herman had said no to God, my classmate Randy would not have been served at Food on the Corner, nor would I have been moved to have my own compassion to see homeless people as just like me. Commentator Alan Cole says of the disciples in this moment, they say send them away, but they're forgetting Christ, the incalculable factor. God does not lead us to see a need unless it be in his mind to use us to meet that need. In verse 37, Jesus answers, "You give them something to eat." This was the test of their understanding. This was the test of their faith. And the multiplication of impact only happens when we say yes to God. The multiplication of impact only happens when we embrace God's compassionate heart for the world and act on it in faith. The multiplication of loaves and fishes only happens when we don't send people away. Herman felt no more adequate or equipped to feed the multitude in Vancouver than the disciples felt to feed the masses that day in Galilee. The difference is that Herman was moved with compassion and he acted in faith. It turns out that the understanding of the loaves, the thing that the disciples didn't understand, was that they missed having God's heart of compassion for the people and relying on it to step out in faith. First, they were hard-hearted. Send the people away, Jesus. And when he prompted them, you give them something to eat, they objected. That would cost more than a half a year's wages. It's impossible. We don't have enough. Well, I don't know about you, but that reminds me of the story of Moses arguing with God at the burning bush. Don't send me to Pharaoh. It reminds me of Jonah asked to go and preach to the people of Nineveh, fleeing from God. How often do I resist the prompting of God? When God speaks to your heart, do you resist him? Perhaps you're resisting God's voice even now. Perhaps you feel inadequate to do what he's asking. Or maybe you feel unworthy. Maybe you don't feel like you can make a difference. Well, the understanding of the loaves is that God's question is not, are you equipped or do you feel able or adequate? It's not, do you have enough to share? Whether it's enough money or stuff or time. The question of God and his prompting today is, do you have his compassion for the world around you? And do you have faith to trust him to multiply what you do have? This is the bridge from disciple to sent one. Without compassion and faith in action, well, we might as well take a seat with the crowd and have a fillet of fish. Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? He knows that you don't have enough. There will always be a gap between what's possible and what's needed. He knows that one person, one group, one church can't do it all. Yet Jesus made 5 loaves and 2 fish enough. Jesus multiplies. In verse 39 and onward, we see that every person was satisfied and ate to their full. He makes it enough. What we need is to embrace his heart of compassion and step out in faith into the world. I want to particularly encourage people who are exploring the Christian faith today. If you're not yet a follower of Jesus and you're exploring with us, I want to encourage you. If you look at the world with compassion, you're showing the heart of God. And if you feel inspired to do something in the world around you, consider that that might be God's voice prompting you to join him. He loves the world and he wants you to love the world just like him. In fact, he'd like to send you into the world to be his hands and feet. God's revealing himself in this story to each of us to show that Jesus came to seek and save and care for lost sheep. And he wants to inspire us to step out in faith, to seek and care for the sheep around us. The disciples' moment of truth, their misunderstanding about the loaves, is a challenge for each one of us to look at our own hearts. God's calling his followers to become sent ones with hearts of compassion, acting in faith. And this is a movement of God to multiply loaves and fishes. But we have to answer the prompting of God. What's the area in your life where God's prompting you to have compassion and faith and take action? Where is He calling you to be a sent one? I want to remind us that our responsibility is to have compassion and act in faith. It's God's responsibility to multiply. Herman had one pot of soup in a Ford Pinto station wagon. The disciples had 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus is the multiplier. And one act of compassion by a sent one of God can multiply under God's power. SouthRidge is working to support the community of Lytton since the wildfire, and some of you might be able to go and be a sent one on our team that goes there to serve them. All of us can support the food bank fundraiser, which has already raised thousands of dollars for the people of Lytton. Consider what you might do, anything, to become involved. Your loaves and fishes can be multiplied with compassion and faith. I shared that Food on the Corner started 40 years ago in 1982, and they've served on average 200 people each week, including my high school classmate Randy, who's no longer homeless, by the way. By my math, that means that in the last 40 years, they've served over 400,000 bowls of soup. Sometimes God's miracle is an accumulation which starts with a mustard seed or a pot of soup in a Ford Pinto station wagon. I mentioned that I work with Baptist Housing, serving seniors across British Columbia. And one of our homes, Hallmark in Abbotsford, has some seniors who were prompted with compassion to do something for the Ukraine. They collect medical supplies from local hospitals who actually discard unused supplies after canceled surgeries. Well, in April, they sent 12 boxes of medical supplies along with knitted toques and blankets to the Ukraine through an Abbotsford charity. They could have said, we can't make a difference, but they didn't. They sent their 5 loaves and 2 fish to Ukraine. Well, I shared this story across Baptist Housing, and a couple of days later, I heard from one of our chaplains over in Victoria. He had shared this with a group of low-income housing residents who were also inspired by God to serve Ukraine. They had set up a by-donation soup and sandwich fundraiser with their fellow residents to raise money for Ukraine, but they hadn't figured out how to get it there. And the story of Hallmark gave them away. And so they sent that same charity their $462.35. That's right, $462.35. Because we know the size of the gift isn't what's important. Jesus does the multiplying. Well, I shared that story of the $462 across Baptist Housing, and a couple days later, I heard from a care aide who works with us in West Vancouver. And her heart was moved to do something for Ukraine, and she wanted to donate $100 personally, and I was able to connect her to that same charity. Jesus does the multiplying. All we need is God's heart of compassion and faith to act. Faith in a Ford Pinto. Faith in a box of medical supplies. Faith in a soup and sandwich fundraiser. Jesus will do the multiplying. That's the understanding of the loaves. I can't explain any more than you can why most events happen in the world, whether it's homelessness, famine, war, or catastrophe. I am much more certain about God's voice and His mission for the church. I have a conviction that whether it's the war on Ukraine, fires in Lytton, or homelessness in our own community, these events for the Christian church, every single time, are a test for us to see if we will respond with God's heart of compassion and then act in faith. God will do the multiplying. So what will you do? How will you respond to God's voice saying, "Feed my sheep"?